Greetings. My name is Alan Feldstein, member 1094, and we are here at the world-famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles, and we have an incredible program for you tonight. I am pleased, proud, honored, and humbled to introduce Azzedine Downes. He is the current president and CEO of the International Fund for Animal Welfare, which he's held since 2012. But before that, he was chief of party for USAID in Jerusalem and Morocco, and was appointed by President Clinton as the acting regional director for the United States Peace Corps in Eurasia and the Middle East. In 2015, he was named one of the most 100 creative people in business, and I can understand why, was named to the prestigious Council of the Most 100, to the Jane Goodall Legacy Foundation in 23. He is a graduate of Providence College and Harvard University and is fluent in Arabic, English, and French, which part of his stories tonight you'll find out why. And he's just published his book, The Couscous Chronicles, which is just a snapshot of an amazing life that has been led and will continue to be led. So welcome, Azzedine.
Thank you very much.
A lot of people want to know, your book was great. I read it. This is my second copy since I left one on an airplane. But I wanted to know a bit about your background. Azzedine is not what we would call a typical name.
Yeah.
And where did you grow up? How did you get Azzedine, and how did that all start?
So I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. My family is Irish-American, second generation. Azzedine is an Arabic name, and it means honor of the religion. Az means honor, and deen is religion, so that's what it means. I'm Muslim, and so my father told me that we're a great combination of the lost Arab-Irish tribe, which I'm not sure actually exists. But yeah, I grew up in Boston. And then when I was very young, I went to school in Switzerland, and that sort of launched me on an international career.
Great. Yeah. And your book is titled The Couscous Chronicles, and I'm curious, how did you come up with that title?
So one, I love couscous, and what I learned writing the book and naming it that was that many people in the States don't know really what couscous is. They think it's kind of a side salad. But it actually is a massive dish that we would eat every Friday after prayers. And I learned a lot about Moroccan culture around couscous and things like barakah and God's gift and God's blessings to you, whether or not the meat fell to you or it fell to your bigger brother over there who was actually taking more. So I thought, well, around couscous it would be a way to talk about food, culture, travel, and some of the intricacies of learning a new culture.
Well, we could spend hours with all the stories. You're a great storyteller in talking about this book. But the book starts with you living in Fez. First of all, how did you come to live there? And then I'd love for you to share the opening of your book and what you did when you first got to Fez to survive. Because I just came back from Morocco, and when I read your book, I thought, that can't be true. And then I went to Fez, and it's absolutely true.
Yeah. So the book starts in the year 1402, and I'm very youthful, as you can see. I've been alive for centuries. Of course, I started that way just to get people to sort of switch their mindset. 1402 was actually the year that I first went to Morocco, but it's the Islamic calendar. And much like the Jewish calendar. So people were saying, well, how could you still be alive? I went as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was always interested in culture, and I just thought Fez was founded in 882 in the current calendar, the Gregorian calendar. All sorts of connections to 1492, Jews and Muslims being forced out of Spain. They settled in Fez. And so when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, you go through training, you start to learn Moroccan Arabic and all of those things. And I looked around the country and I looked at the map, and I thought I could wind up in the flats of Kharibga where they mine phosphates. And I thought, that is a horrible place. So I told them a lie that I had a fear of flat places. And so I was assigned to Fez. And Fez, as you now know, is this incredible bowl with a labyrinth. And we wound up living in an old palace. And it was actually cheaper for myself and my roommate to live in this old palace. But we couldn't figure out how to get there. And so we used to take chalk and we would go out 2 o'clock in the morning and we put little X's in little lines, like take a left here, take a right here. Because there were no cars. There was literally sometimes 6 feet wide. But then we learned that there was a little shaitan, as we call it, a little Satan child, who would also sneak out and he would erase our markings and he would say, take a left instead of a right. And of course, we were always lost. But that's how I wound up in Fez. Yeah.
There's a lot of great stories in your book about you living in Fez, and I want to touch on a few. But one of the things I found amusing is that even though you were a Peace Corps volunteer, for some reason, many people thought you worked for the CIA.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Well, 'cause
And did you?
There's an article that just was published 2 weeks ago saying that I am. So it's stuck with me. You know, it's just an odd thing. And the way that it started was I went to school in Switzerland, so I spoke French, and I did all my studies in French. And Morocco, of course, was a colony. And in the north, it was a colony of Spain, and in the south, it was a colony of France. And I thought, if they find out that I ever speak French, I'll never learn Arabic. And so I separated my life, and I lived in the old city, and I would only speak Arabic. So my Arabic got very, very good very quickly. And it was really the French teachers who started the rumor that I was a CIA agent, because how could I speak French and Arabic and function where they could not? So I think that's how it actually started. Yeah.
So you met some very interesting people in Fez. I loved your story about the glue sniffers who made shoes. But there was a woman there you met, Fatuma, I think is how you pronounce her name.
Yes, Fatuma.
And how would you describe Fatuma in one word?
A stalker. Yeah, she was a stalker. Yeah, Baby Reindeer, I was traumatized watching it because it reminded me of Fatuma. You know, and I made mistakes, and this is how the CIA thing got going too, is because I wanted a tutor, and she was a teacher at the school, so I said, oh, this works. And, you know, we learned a lot about culture and things that are still true today. I mean, you don't have girlfriends, you don't have boyfriends. And I thought, well, she's a teacher, she can be my tutor. I went to her house and suddenly realized there was no family there. We had no chaperone. She made me couscous all the time. But then she said that I had to marry her so that I could pay off her mortgage. And I didn't want to. So she became a stalker.
And she put a curse on you, if I
She put a
remember.
curse on me, and she said I would never marry another woman if I didn't marry her. And, you know, it's odd things, but when you're surrounded by people who actually believe that this is true, this is actually happening, and I'm actually married to someone like that right now, but I started to go to friends, and I said, listen, she put this curse on me, and I'm in trouble. I mean, she was making all sorts of accusations, and, you know, I looked at her, and that was equivalent of having sex and things like that. So they said, oh, you have to have the curse removed. And so that's what I did.
And how did you have that curse removed?
We went up into the mountains, and I think it's someplace, you know, I was telling you about when you're going to Chefchaouen, coming down from Tangiers. There's a town that sits atop the hill, Moulay Idris. And certain parts only Muslims can go, so you couldn't go into the inner sanctum. But I went with my Moroccan family that I was living with, and sat with, you know, an imam, and I told him what had happened, and so he repeated a lot of prayers, and then we sat in silence, and then he repeated more prayers, and we sat in more silence, and I'm thinking, I don't know what's happening. How does this all end? And then he finally said, please give me $5. Yeah.
The curse had to have been removed because you ended up getting married.
That's right.
And not to Fatuma.
That's right.
And one of the things I love in your book was it was basically an arranged marriage.
Yeah.
And you sent a note to your then-to-be wife that I'm going to quote from the book that says, "Dear Nadia, how are you? By the way, we are getting married on August 25th. I have blue eyes. See you then."
Yeah.
And that was the entire conversation?
Yeah, yeah. Kismet or maktub, things are written, right? So I met this young Moroccan fellow on the plane coming back to the States, and we became friendly. And I was going back to Morocco for work and things like that. And he said, "Well, do you want to get married?" And I said, "Well, in theory, yes, in theory." And he said, "Okay." And that was pretty much it. And then I was in Morocco and I met his family, but no one knew what was going on. And then he phoned again and he said, "Do you still want to get married?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm adventurous. I'm an adventurer. But I want to know who she is." "Okay, thanks." Boom. And then I thought, oh, I guess I'm getting married. And I was back in the States and I told my father, because her mom unfortunately had breast cancer and she passed away, and it was kind of a sad moment in our lives. But he said, "What are you doing in Philadelphia?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to see my friend's mom, and I might be engaged when I get back." He says, "You don't even date women. You don't even know anyone." And I said, "Yeah, I know, but when I get back, I think I'll be engaged." And I was. And that was it. And we were watching Zulu Dawn. And then they switched off the television. And her mom said, "Yeah, the wedding's on that date, and you have blue eyes, and I love them, and I hope your children have blue eyes."
And your wife was living in
she
Morocco.
she was in Morocco.
Right.
Yeah, and it was her sister who actually wrote this long letter, which is lost, and I talk about that in the book.
Right.
And I suddenly panicked because I thought, well, does she want to marry me? And writing the book, I realized I've never asked her to marry me.
To this day.
To this day, yeah. So if you have suggestions, I'm open. Yeah, yeah.
So how long have you been married for now?
36 years.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
yeah,
It just from how are you, by the way, we're getting married, I have blue eyes.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of younger people that are very jealous and upset by that fact.
Well, yeah. People say, "Well, how do you persevere? How do you marry someone?" That's one of the stories that I always tell is, what is it like to marry someone that you don't know? So we wound up in Yemen, and Nadia was having the baby, my son Aziz, and she wasn't a citizen. So Yemen has the highest death mortality, infant mortality rate in the world. So she went to the States, and she had the baby. And when she came back, she had all the women over the house and everything talking about birthing and pregnancy and morning sickness. And I said, "Oh, you were so lucky. You never had morning sickness." And she said, "Oh, I did. The first 2 months were awful." I said, "But you never told me." She said, "Well, I didn't know you that well." And I was like, okay, I think that wraps it up. Yeah.
And because of the adventurous life that you've led, I understand from reading the book, you were never present at the birth of your children.
Yeah, except for Sharif. Except
Okay.
for Sharif. And I have a little grandson now, and my daughter's having a baby, inshallah, next month. And I'm supposed to be in Zimbabwe. And I told the board, I said, "Listen, I cannot miss the birth of my children, because I, at the time, worked for someone who wouldn't let me go."
Right.
Yeah, so, but Sharif I saw.
Well, you say someone wouldn't let you go, and that's one of the other things I found in the book is your ability to deal with bureaucrats.
Yeah.
Because you came from Morocco back to the United States, if I remember correctly,
That's right,
and you worked here. And what were you doing here in the U.S. when you came back from
When
Morocco?
I first came back, I worked for the Peace Corps in Washington, D.C., and State Department liaison, things like that.
And then they wanted you to go to Yemen, correct?
Yeah.
And let's talk about the household effects, because I have a friend, and one of his favorite lines that I've stolen, adopted, and love is that people like that, bureaucrats, insurance people and all that, is small minds in big buildings.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think this is what you came across.
Yeah. So the household effect. So we got married. But I didn't have a house. I didn't have a chair. She didn't have anything. And so, when you're in the State Department, you get sent off to around the world. They ship all of your household effects, and that means your stuff. And I didn't know what it meant, and they kept asking, where are your household effects? And I said, well, I just don't have any. They said, well, you must have household effects. And it went on for months. And so then they didn't believe that this was my wife. They didn't believe that I was who I was supposed to be. And that goes into the whole CIA thing. I say, why? You're too mysterious. You're too mysterious. And you don't have any household effects. And it went on for really for a year when we got to Yemen. And it has stuck with me ever since. And even the work that I do at IFAW. I really detest mindless bureaucracy, and I just don't believe in it. And I've seen, even in the work that I did in Jerusalem, in Yemen, and evacuation, that bureaucrats will choose the process over a human life. And I could never abide that, and that's how I manage even now.
Well, you had some other amazing examples of small minds in big buildings, one of which was the administrator in Yemen who refused to believe that your wife was not your Arab maid and that you were not Muslim.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, it's interesting. In State Department, and I have a lot of friends who worked for the State Department. Thankfully, they've all retired and they can't sue me, but there's a level of racism even in people that you would assume are worldly. And this little cretin of a bureaucrat would not believe that Nadia Ben Khayat, and Muslim women keep their name, they don't take the name of their husbands, that she was my wife. He said, we will not give you the mail for your maid. And we're living in an Arab country with women who are, well-to-do and well-educated and have positions. But for him, an Arab woman must be a maid. And I had to go to the ambassador and say, listen, this is absolute racism. And he would say, you cannot be Muslim. You don't look Muslim, you don't sound Muslim. And it's interesting in the US, it's a longer story, but Malcolm X and all of the Nation of Islam, he goes to Mecca and realizes how wrong his view of Islam was. You go and you see people from around the world, from Uzbekistan and Afghanistan and Chinese Muslims, and I was struck, and it's really one of the reasons why I never wanted to work for the State Department. And is it my job to educate everyone in the bureaucracy? And I just didn't think it was. And so I would go to the highest, power source, and that was the ambassador, and just said, you have to shut this guy down.
But you also were very clever and very good at getting around bureaucracy because, as you correctly say, you didn't put the process over human life. For example, you were responsible for evacuating a lot of Peace Corps volunteers out of Yemen.
That's right.
And those days when there was another civil war, unlike the one that's going on now. And talk a little bit about, Azzedine, about how you solved those problems, because you had people living in the mountains all over the country, and there was no cell phones in those days.
That's right. Yeah, there were no cell phones, and we used to come up with codes. And we had two volunteers who were way up in the mountains along the Saudi border, and I would go up there, and then we would come up with stories to bring people down into the capital city if they were ever in danger. But one of the stories that we said was, my uncle is dying. And then the sheikh at one point said, how many uncles does this kid have? I mean, there's like an uncle dying every other week. So it was dangerous and in incredibly dangerous places. But I just would try to find people who had their own authority. And sometimes it was US military, and sometimes it was military intelligence. Sometimes it was. And I was never in the military, and I was in the Peace Corps. But I found that a lot of times the military would just cut through the nonsense. And the story of us all sitting together in Washington, and we were evacuating. I had left Yemen myself. We had the second Gulf War. And the head bureaucrat says, we had 54 people left in Yemen. So how are we going to get these people out? And ideas. And so that same bureaucrat was now back in Washington, and he said, well, we should put out 3 bids, TWA, Pan Am, and I'm thinking, but the people could be killed. And there was a colonel, and he raises his hand, and he said, sir, the moment you give me the order, I will have those people out of Yemen in 24 hours. Good idea. Good. Anyone else? Anyone else? And they went with the 3 bids.
Really?
They went with the 3 bids. And honestly, I thought if American people knew the inner workings of some of the inane discussions, they would be furious. So, when people talk about, the government and it's too big and all the things, there is an element of that, even with people's lives.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you had to leave Yemen.
Yeah.
And then your next posting was after the wall came down, correct?
Yes.
And you went to Romania and Bulgaria.
Yeah.
And 2 things I found very interesting in your book was, number one is your kids were very young, and as kids do, they're able to pick up language very quickly. So your son became, I think, your fixer in Bulgaria, right? Because he could speak Bulgarian.
Yeah, that's right. And
How old was he?
He was, I think, 4 and 5. I put him in a little school, and I like languages, and I always think it's respectful. So I would say "Dobar den, kak ste," and he's like, please do not speak Bulgarian to me. But they were fluent. They were fluent in Bulgarian, and my daughter actually was her first language. It was her first language, her first words, because the grandmother upstairs, they love grandchildren, and she spent all the time up there. And it was so embedded in her that when we moved back to Morocco, she was at school and she was sobbing one day, and the teacher said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Well, I forgot my language." She said, "No, but you speak English and you speak Arabic." She said, "No, I'm Bulgarian." I got called down to the headmaster's office, like, "You lied. You said you're American citizens. You're Bulgarian." I'm like, "We're not Bulgarians, But I did rely on them. Because they just picked it up, and they don't know it anymore. My son Aziz said one day, I'm not going to speak that language anymore because I speak a big language. I speak English. So it's extraordinary. Yeah,
That is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And what was your sort of job, for lack of, what were you asked to do in Romania and Bulgaria?
So a little bit different. Romania was a horrific situation because I was asked to go there to work with the orphans. Remember, with Ceausescu, and the society had completely collapsed. There was very, very little food, mostly pork, which I don't eat, and cabbage and cheese. No lights, electricity was out. But we went to those orphanages, and I'll always remember they slept in metal cribs. There's no heat, and in the morning their tiny fingers were frozen to the slats of the crib, and yet we had to pour warm water to remove there. And when you picked them up, they were so heavy, and I couldn't figure out at first, and I realized if you ever pick up a sack of potatoes, it's dead weight, and I never knew what dead weight really meant until that day. They had no muscle tone because no one would touch them because they believed they all had AIDS, and no one would touch them. So you'd pick them up, and they were like putty, and really, really heavy. And the sad thing about that was we learned that they weren't orphans, that their parents had given them up because Ceausescu had banned birth control and abortions, and people abandoned the children. So that was Romania, and I tell funny stories about Romania and Dracula and things like that. But Bulgaria, I worked on small business, and I set up a series of centers which I called. It was a network. It was a network, multi-system centers, and the idea was to find markets in Western Europe for all of the Bulgarian products, because it was a communist society, and so they didn't ever have to market anything; they just built things, and so, yeah,
And it was another one of your ways of getting around bureaucracy, because you got computers and desks and everything like that when it would have taken years to get those.
I did, and you know how that happened? I just wrote to George Soros, and I said, "Listen, I need computers," and he had set up. Trying to think of his NGO at the time, New Society or something like that, and he provided those things with me. We had to get cars, and I just went to Germany and I bought the cars, and
the bureaucrats must have gone nuts.
They did. They really, really disliked me. But then the ambassador was like, "Can I borrow your car?" So he let me get away with a lot of stuff, and I did get it because let's say I bent the rules. I bent the rules, yeah.
And talk about the brassiere factory in Bulgaria.
Yeah. So you may not know I'm a fashion designer as well. No, that's not true. That's not true. The first success that I had was with cheese, Syrian-made cheese, and it's like feta cheese. So they have a really, really good cheese. And so this fellow had a cheese factory. And he came to me and he said, "Well, here's your commission." It was $25,000 or something. But of course, I couldn't take anything because I was a government employee. He said, "Okay, well, I have another idea. I have a women's lingerie factory." And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about women's lingerie except what I've learned from Victoria's Secret, But he convinced me to go, so I go, and he made the biggest bras I've ever seen in my life. And they had wires that were as big as the transatlantic cable. And I said, "Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to wear this. I'll ask my wife, but no one's going to wear these." She's like, "Please, please. They're strong. They're sturdy. They're for German women, for Russian women." I said, "Yeah, I don't think it's going to work." And so that was a failure. That was a failure, yeah. And they went under. But, a lot of times people would say that the reason that the Soviet Union fell was because no one wanted to wear Bulgarian shoes. They were just so bad. But in that system, Bulgaria was given shoes, brassieres, and the number one export was computer viruses.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. So it was pretty amazing. And I had the kids with me. Sharif wasn't born yet, but there was no food, so I had to send them to Morocco. And I used to go to Greece on weekends to bring food back. Yeah.
Then after Bulgaria and Romania, you went to the Middle East again, to Jerusalem.
Right.
And that was in your book, again, a scary, fascinating, funny experience for you. What were you doing in Jerusalem?
So I went with the peace accords, the Oslo peace accords. And it was interesting because I had been at the Peace Corps, and when the accords were signed down at the White House, and Rabin was there, and Yasser Arafat, and so I went down, and this is kind of like the world. At that moment, I never knew. I'm looking at the people that I'm actually going to be working with in the future, but I didn't know at the time. So when the opportunity came up to go and work with the Palestinian Authority to set up all of the systems, I went, and it was a very violent time. The bus bombings in Gaza, and our office was in Gaza, and some of the stories are funny. And this is what I always try to say about the Palestinian-Israeli situation, is that there are so many wonderful people. There's so many wonderful people, and their voices are kind of drowned out. But you sit down with people who would say in Gaza, before 48, their best friends were the Jewish families. They would go out on picnics. They would go swimming. But ultimately, it became so violent. And little Sharif, I had to rescue him in a pharmacy that was blocked by burning cars and things. And I thought that I can't do this with the little ones. So in '97 we left Jerusalem.
And and you headed back to the United States at that point in time?
To Morocco, back to Morocco.
Back to Morocco.
Yeah, back to Morocco.
Yeah.
And I was working on girls' education there. Yeah.
So your book starts out amazingly so, particularly for me, that the foreword's written by Jane Goodall.
Yeah.
Who, it's Jane Goodall.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
what more can you say? How did you meet Jane? How did you get to know Jane?
Yeah. So we were in Ireland, and I had Sharif with me, and he's the little one. So that's why Jane, when you read the foreword. So if you've ever been to one of Jane's talks, she often starts with the hoot, the and so Sharif says to me, "What is she doing? Can she really talk to chimpanzees?" So I said, "Well, let's just go and ask her." So we did, and Sharif had a little chat with her, and I tried, and so we became friends. So that was a millennial. It was a millennial conference in Limerick, and I learned from the very first moments that she has an incredible sense of humor, and that doesn't always come out in the public because she's very well known and she's very famous, but. She just celebrated her 90th birthday, and of course she works in conservation. She has Roots and Shoots, which is working with children around the world, and you could set up a chapter here, for example, if someone wanted to do that, and we work with them. So over the years we just became very, very good friends, and we spend a lot of time together when she can, and we cross paths. So I asked her if she would write the foreword because she had met Sharif and she knows some of the funny stories. But she was the one, the subtitle includes donkeys. And she says, if you don't put donkeys in there, I'm not going to. But she loves donkeys. She loves donkeys.
Well, and in Fez too, I had the experience that you wrote about in the book that donkeys can tie up traffic in Fez for a long time because of that and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, we were together. I was telling you about IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and she was giving a speech. I was giving a speech, and she doesn't like to eat in public because she gets kind of mobbed. And she said, "Well, come up to the room." And my wife Nadia was with me, and I phoned up, and I went up, and I get to the room, and she's not there. And I said, she literally was on the phone telling me to come up. She said, "Well, she left a note for you on the table over there." So I went over to the note, and it was in Hawaii, and there was this balustrade, this sort of false balcony. We're on the 19th floor. She has crawled out the window to scare me. And I could...
How old is she at this time?
Yeah, 86. I could go down in history for the man who killed Jane Goodall. I went like this, and I was ready to whack her. And she's like, "Wasn't that jolly fun?" And I was like, "Yes, it was. Get your butt inside this again." But yeah, so that's how we know each other, and we do a lot of work in conservation. And of course, she, Gombe is in Tanzania, and we work in Kenya and across into Tanzania. So yeah, that's how we know each other. Yeah.
Well, I asked you this question because I thought it'd be the perfect segue to come out of your work in the Peace Corps and the USAID, which was phenomenal work, but you became CEO of IFA, and now involved in matters near and dear to my heart with conservation and stuff. How did IFA find you? Tell us about IFA.
Yeah. So IFAW is the International Fund for Animal Welfare. It was founded in 1969 up in Canada. If you remember the white coat seals, so that's how it started. We work in 40 different countries around the world, and it really was my connection to some people that I knew at the Peace Corps, who then went to IFAW from the environmental side, and the organization really was offices doing great work, but they didn't even know one another. So it's not the organization that it is today. So the first thing that they asked me to do was to sort of create the organization as opposed to a collection of projects and programs. And so that's how it started. And as I said, I'm an adventurer. I didn't really do all my homework that I should have. And the first meeting I had with IFAW, I was in London, and I kept saying, well, I'm at the headquarters, I'm at the headquarters. And they said, what are you talking about? London is the headquarters. It's like, my God, I just moved to Cape Cod. What are you doing? But you know, how it started was like adventurers, right? Travel and finding extraordinary people who were doing extraordinary things to save the lives of animals, and fund them. But there wasn't a cohesive strategy. So that was really my job. And where we are today is we have two pillars, and it's rescue and conservation. And the reason I chose those, because rescue is a snapshot, a photo in time. And you can rescue that animal, but if they don't have a place to live, they're going to wind up in a zoo or a sanctuary, or be killed or be culled. And so we brought those two things together. So we rescue marine mammals, we rescue whales, we rescue dolphins, seals, turtles, but then elephants, you know. So you know this because you're out there all the time. We rescue a baby elephant that has been lost, abandoned for whatever reason, or the mother is killed by trophy hunters. And it's a commitment over 50, 60 years. And so the conservation side is to protect the land. And you know, conservation, and we were just kind of chatting about this, the history of conservation really, even in the United States, was really founded by hunters in Teddy Roosevelt and things like that. And so it's evolved, and all of these things that you see were protected at one time by conservationists. So the idea that the animals live in one place and the people live outside, so there's fences and national parks. I always call it fortress conservation. Animals locked inside, people locked outside. So in 2019, I launched the new brand, which really has the tagline of animals and people thriving together. And I'm just absolutely convinced, and a lot of it does have to do with the work that I did with Peace Corps and other things, is that if we don't invest in the people that live with wildlife, we're not going to succeed.
But you have this amazing ability to get consensus and agreement. And one of the things we had dinner the other night, you told me, which I was shocked, and then I chuckled at your great ability, is you were in an African country, I'll say that,
Yeah.
and one of the ministers said he wanted to assassinate you because of the work that you were doing, and he was probably engaged in illegal wildlife trade.
Yeah.
And you asked him, can't we just agree on one thing? And he said no. Finish the story.
So he said no. He said, I want to put a gun to your head and blow your brains out right now. And I said, well, could we agree on one thing? He said, no. I said, well, could we agree that you won't assassinate me right now? And he said, yes. You're a very strange guy.
But you got an agreement out of him.
I did. And I've seen him since. And we completely disagree with one another. But how can something like that happen? And I think a lot of it has to do with faith. And you know, I joke about it too, but even some of the stories about driving in Yemen and people saying, aren't you afraid? And I have had death threats, and I've had a friend who was assassinated. I don't mind dying. I just want it to be quick. You know? And so trying to be calm, and I think even in the work that we do now, is that if you are calm and you say things that people don't expect you to say, it somehow diffuses the anger or the violence, because they don't expect it, and then they step back, and if you can remain calm. So I think that's, you know, many times where there's been real violence. But that fellow has diplomatic immunity, and it did go through my mind. I wonder if he kills me, can he just have immunity and he'll walk out of here? But he didn't kill me, obviously.
Obviously, and which we're very grateful for and stuff. Talk about some of the great programs that that IFAW is doing right now.
Yeah, so our biggest program right now is called Room to Roam. And this is focused on elephants, but it helps all wildlife in a particular habitat. And we chose 12 critical habitats that go all the way from Kenya down into Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Not so much South Africa because Kruger is there and things like that. But the idea is that if there are corridors, and it's not a highway, but it's a pathway that connects areas. So if you look at national parks, some of them work well, some of them don't work well. And because of human encroachment, they're blocked. And so this is where you see elephants being hit by trains or cars or people being killed. And so our strategy, again, is really to focus on the elephants as ambassadors and all of the people that live in those areas. And so Kenya, I would say, is about 20 years ahead of some of the other places we work. The community conservancy model is one that has taken hold where the community themselves manage, and they're custodians. Because I asked them, I said, I wanted to use the right word. And they said, well, we're custodians of the land. And it's all of the pieces of land that connect. So if you look at Kenya all the way from the Savos down near, all the way to the coast, Chulu Hills, to Amboseli, which is a very famous place, Loita, which is a sacred forest, and then into the Mara. And we lease, rent, or just support the conservancies that are now run by the Maasai in that particular area. Yeah.
My Maasai son, who I pay for college, is supported by you guys,
That's
which
right.
I'm
That's
which I'm very grateful of. And it is a big problem, and it's fantastic. You talk about conservancy. We had Dr. Lori Marker here on Sunday. And, Namibia has conservancy written into their constitution, and they have conservancy. Do you think this is the model for the future?
Yeah, so what's that? And I'll just give you an example in Kenya, and President Ruto, and I met with him the last time I was there, working with the Maasai. He was very excited about the model of handing over some of the national parks to the county governments, and that has actually happened. So Amboseli is a small place. It couldn't exist without the land around it. So it is working. There's a lot of naivete about what it takes to manage parks. There's all sorts of arguments about the money. There's carpetbaggers coming in with the climate change and carbon sequestration. So there are a lot of problems, but I would say that the next generation is devoted to conservation, but they don't want tokenism. They don't want the leftovers of a trophy hunt. It's just not what they want. They want to find ways to actually have lives that we have. And they do ask me that. Why would people in California care about an elephant? And it's something difficult for them to understand. We work, Zimbabwe is a big nut for us because we oppose the SADC countries. So the SADC countries are the Southern African Development Council. They're very much into what we call sustainable development. They want to sell ivory. They want to sell rhino horns. And we always oppose that at the international fora. And so some of the questions that you're asking me about, how is it that I do some of the things that I do? It's because I listen. I am respectful even if we don't agree. And other organizations, conservation organizations, cannot understand how we can work in Zimbabwe and oppose the sale of ivory at CITES. And it's because we have good relationships, and it takes years. And the other thing that we've done is we've formed a traditional leaders council of conservationists in Africa, and we brought tribal chiefs from Zambia and Botswana and Malawi up to Kenya, so that they could see how the Maasai live, and they were just astounded. I mean, the Maasai don't eat wildlife, so we're already ahead of the game there. But I would say that I'm optimistic, but the pressure to buy land from people who have never owned land is so great. There's a lot of carpetbagging going on.
There is.
Yeah.
There's a lot, and I know in Amboseli area where I'm very involved, there's lots of speculators. There's, you know, I've been offered land, you know, and I don't need any land in Kenya, so I politely decline. But you know, you said something, Azzedine, I think it is really important. In reading your book, one of the things that you, wherever you were, was your ability to listen and to communicate. And it sounds to me like what I'm hearing you say is that's sort of the solution for conservation as well. As we may not agree on, and it's a problem in this country, we don't listen to each other, we just yell at each other, is if we listen and we talk, we can find common ground, even if it means I'm not going to assassinate you right now. At least we have that agreement and stuff.
You know, but Alan, my first foray into conservation, when I went to CITES, which is the UN Convention on Trade of Species, there's so much zealotry on either side that they won't speak to one another. The first thing I noticed was all of the NGOs were in one part of the convention area, and they just spent all the time talking to each other. And we don't vote. So the countries vote. I think there's 169. It's a UN convention. And I asked them, so why are you sitting in this room sending emails to one another? And they said, well, you know, that fellow is a Japanese ivory trader, and he's a very difficult person, and he insults us. And I said, yeah, I know. I just had tea with him. And he said, you're a horrible person, and I hope you die. And I said, that's fine. But why do you sell ivory? So we have to get over this zealotry. I know, and it's filled. I mean, you know, Africa is filled with people who are going to save Africa. And I always like to say, when I go meet with community leaders, I don't go with a plan in my back pocket and say, this is what you're supposed to do. I go with a mirror. And I try to mirror what is it that they want. Because most people want what we all want. We want our children to be healthy, and we want them to go to school, and we don't want to be afraid to go out, you know, and be killed by an elephant. Those are all things that we all want. And so they're not evil people. Sometimes people are doing things, they're selling ivory because they had to survive. And I never agree with it, but I know that's why they did it.
Well, I think that's a great lesson for everybody to learn is, and I like your concept of the mirror and being able to communicate, because without communicating, we can't even begin to find a common ground and stuff. So, you know, your book is amazing, and it talks about that. So people who are here, we have books for sale, and I would strongly advise buying a copy. For those of you who are listening on our live stream, you can go on Amazon and all the popular places and get a copy of the Couscous Chronicle. At this point in time, I'd like to open it up to some questions, if anybody has any. Please.
Jane Goodall, member 1213. Thank you so much for your work and for being here and sharing your perspective. I actually have a question for your son. As you're growing up, how much did you realize that you were growing up in interesting times with an interesting family? And then how much about your childhood did you learn when the books came out?
I think a lot of the... It's a great question.
So a lot of what was in the book at the time, maybe that shaped me subconsciously because I was young. So I think, it had definitely an impact on the way I think today and being very open to different cultures and people. What happened after the book, we I mostly grew up on Cape Cod, so had a very regular, normal childhood living in a small town. And then IFAW brought us to Dubai when I was in high school. So I went to high school there for a year. And then we moved to the Netherlands. So I graduated high school from the Netherlands. So I think going to 3 high schools in 3 different countries definitely shaped who I am today. And I definitely get that same adventure bug probably from my father, where I just moved to LA 6 months ago on a whim. So that's why I'm here tonight. But I was living in New York and saw the sunshine and the West Coast and just decided to try it out. And then I think the stories in the book, I maybe was a sounding board for a lot of them, in terms of reliving my childhood through reading the book, and then also the process of my father writing it. So there was a lot of times where, he was writing a lot of it during COVID, where we're in lockdown. So he would be upstairs writing for hours and come down and would tell me these stories again, or me maybe unlocking a memory. So it was really cool to see it in development, and then get to actually read the book again. So now I have a memory, my father's memoir, but I get to also relive part of my life too.
Great.
Yeah, that's great.
So
Yeah, great answer.
I've got a question, if there's no burning one from the house, and that is on all the people who want to save Africa. My favorite ex-wife was a Peace Corps volunteer in Madagascar.
Yeah.
20 years ago, they had a movement called Goodbye Fizah, Goodbye Foreigner,
Yeah.
because they'd figured out all these people coming to try to help them had not fixed their problem,
Yeah.
and they ended up just being this kind of foreigners drinking club and a community of expats.
Yeah.
And that only the people are going to solve their own problems. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, what I saw in the Peace Corps, I probably have a very different view of it. I think it's much better for the U.S. than it is for anywhere we ever went, because you hopefully learn so much and then come back, and it shapes how open you can be to various things in the United States. But it's still a huge problem. Not so much Peace Corps volunteers per se, but when I was saying I went to CITES. So CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and I remember it was the first time I went in Kenya. There were probably 3,000 people from NGOs around the world, and those NGOs were made up of 1 or 2 people. And the thing that struck me was they can't work with anyone. They can't work with anyone. And that's why they set up their own thing. And even in the work that we have today, Peace Corps has shaped how we hire people. So we don't have an expat system at IFAW. If you go to Kenya, it's all Kenyans. If you go to Malawi, it's all Malawians, Zambia, et cetera, et cetera. And that is very unique for a lot of organizations, but I truly believe in that, and that's why it's animals and people thriving together. It doesn't matter what I say, and I can tell lots of stories, and we don't have all time, but the number of women who say, "I will help you because what you did for me and allowed me to blossom, to do the things that I wanted to do anyway. You didn't tell me." So there's still an element of racism in conservation, and when you go to the international fora, one of the things I'm trying to do is change the face of conservation, I call it, and it's to include women in meaningful ways, and sometimes you'll hear things like, "Oh, we want to give you a seat at the table," and I always say that, "Oh, we're going to get a token person from one country to sit at the table." I get invited to do all sorts of things, and I think it's just unfair. And so I said, well, I don't want you, I'm not giving you a seat at my table. I want to sit at your table. And, you know, and you know this, Alan, because when you talk about sitting under the tree, that's a real thing. Sometimes, you know, you can sit under the tree and discuss for 3 days. But that's what they do. And the savior complex is still there. It's still there. And one of the ways that it's manifested is after, you know, Afghanistan war and Iraq war is the anti-poaching. The number of ex-military who decided to set up their own NGOs and become snipers because they could do it better. So the politics and the racism and the cultural aspects of conservation is so ingrained in history. It's a lot to overcome. So I always try to check myself too. You know, I mean, I am blessed that I have the opportunity to speak to people around the world, and so I do try to even set, you know, funds aside to make sure that we were at the Expo 2020 in Dubai, and the Women's Pavilion, which was sponsored by the Cartier jewelers, and it was all for women. And I said, well, I don't need to be on the stage. And they said, well, your name is Azzedine. We thought you were a woman anyway. And I said, okay, well, you know, I'll sit off to the side. But it's a problem. It's a problem still. Yeah.
So I was struck by what you said about bureaucrats put process over people. I've had similar experiences. Do you only deal with it by going above them, or have you found ways to work with them better?
I'll tell you, at IFAW, we have about 350 people, staff. The WWF office in China is 350 people. There's thousands of people. I just don't believe in it. So internally, there are, you know, if you get funding, so we have USAID funding, you have to follow the rules. You have to follow the rules. But even by following the rules, I say that there has to be impact. And I think if you have good relationships, even with people who want to do good things, I say do the right thing first and fill out the paperwork later. And sometimes I get in trouble, but I'm not in jail, so.
Azzedine, in your, one of the quotes on your book, it says that Azzedine is from Ned Benson, and it says Azzedine is a citizen of the world. Is that how you feel? I wondered, because you were born in the US, you spent a lot of time in Morocco and in Europe.
Yeah.
Where's your heart?
Sharif, don't tell mama. You know, it's interesting because, you know, Alan, you asked me the question, and a lot of people have read the book. So, well, why did you start it there? Why didn't you tell your whole origin story and things like that? But, you know, my family is Irish. I never thought I was an American. I never thought that. And why? Because they just drilled it into us that we were Irish, you were Irish. And when I was 16, I applied to high schools, and there was, you know, nationality. I wrote Irish, and my father said, "You're not Irish. You're an American." I was like, I was 16 when I realized, oh, I have to put American. So was that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, but that's how I felt, and I always loved languages. So today, I got my hair cut, and the barber says right away, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Rhode Island." She said, "I don't believe that. I don't believe you." And I said, "Well, no, I live in Rhode Island." She said, "Yeah, but you sound something else. You sound something else." And I didn't want to get into the whole bloody thing, so I said, "I'm Irish." And she said, "I don't think so. You sound Colombian." So why did that happen? And then I said, "Okay, you have to read my book, because that's the whole story." So I gave her a book. But yeah, citizen of the world, I feel comfortable in places, and sometimes I just don't feel like I have to explain every single thing about your life, right? But
Fair enough.
yeah.
Azzedine, are there opportunities for people to volunteer for IFAW?
Yeah, so on the East Coast there are. On the East Coast there are, because we have our marine mammal rescue teams. And you can't just say I'm a volunteer. You have to go through a process of, because it's dangerous, you could. In the rest of the U.S., and we can follow up, we do have disaster response and rescue, and if there are wildfires or landslides, mudslides, things like that in California, there's a network of volunteers who will respond, and it's a network that's larger than IFAW. Some of the things that I try to think about is if people are going to places where we work, and they have their doctors or artists or educators, there's ways to get involved. But the one thing I would caution against, and I think, Alan, you could jump in here too, is it's a complicated world, and I think what happens sometimes is people want to volunteer, and then they say they'll set up their own project, and then they don't realize that there's all these other things happening. So there are ways, but what we do is the response and the rescue, and it's a process. It's a process, but we can talk about that, how you could plug yourself in. Yeah.
I've got a conservation question, and that is, when I went to law school 30 years ago, the idea that animals needed or deserved a lawyer, and that we'd use the legal process for animal rights or land rights.
Yeah.
And yet in America, the idea has gotten traction that people can have a lawyer for a piece of land or an animal. Do you think this model might apply to the rest of the world, or is that another bad American export?
I think rights are a human concept, and I think it's a good strategy in places where the construct of a judicial right is well established. In most places where we work, Sharif used to work for WeWork, by the way, but it's not an accepted concept. And mostly it's an emotional response. And I'll just tell you, like when I first went to Dubai, we set up the office. And so even our name, and it's, welfare has a very different meaning here in the US than it does in the UK. But the first thing that people will say is, what about my rights? What about my rights? There's some interesting things, like Costa Rica is very progressive, and water has rights. The river has rights. And it will only work if there's a judicial construct. In places where people have no rights, I just don't think it can work. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you very much for just an incredible evening and a great conversation. I really do appreciate it. For those of you here, please, we're here every Thursday, and we have presentations. Please come. For those of you watching on our live stream feed, please subscribe to our channel. And again, we have presentations every Thursday you can tune in on. So when you're in town, come visit at the world famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rhode Island is a very different country.
Yes, yeah, I've been there.
You want to be adventurous, you should go to Rhode Island.
All right, thank you all for joining us tonight. There's